Some of you know me well enough to know that I like poetry. And a few of you will also know that T.S. Eliot is my favourite poet, enough to want to name my firstborn son after him. As James Joyce wrote the seminal 20th century modernist novel Ulysses, so in the same year, 1922, T.S. Eliot wrote the seminal 20th century modernist poem, The Wasteland, which is widely considered to be the most important poem of that century. And he wasn't just a one-poem wonder. He went on to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948. Even now, 98 years after Eliot published The Wasteland, there is still an annual prize given to the best work of poetry each year. It's called the T.S. Eliot Prize, and it's worth £20,000 to the winner. Did you know that in 2020 you could win 20k for writing a poem? Does that make you a bit more interested in poetry, perhaps? 40 years ago, Andrew Lloyd Webber, perhaps the greatest living showman, turned T.S. Eliot's 1939 collection of poems, Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, into a modern musical called Cats. It ran in the West End in London and on Broadway in New York for many years. Since 1980, it's been translated into 15 different languages and has been professionally produced in more than 30 different countries. It's been made into a film twice, once in 1998 and most recently last year, featuring an ensemble cast including James Corden, Judi Dench, Idris Elba and Taylor Swift. And by a strange twist of providence, you can watch the first of those two films tonight at 9 p.m. on the Freeview channel Sky Arts. So they're still showing it today, literally today. By 1994, Cats the musical had taken over $2 billion, the highest grossing musical at that time. And to date, Cats has grossed $3.5 billion. This is one popular musical. Undoubtedly, T.S. Eliot was a literary genius. But for all his fame and reputation as a great poet, there is a dark side to Eliot's poems, the elephant in the room that rarely gets talked about. There is a stain on his otherwise gold-plated reputation. It seems that Eliot had an anti-Semitic streak in him. It's evident in some of his poems where he pokes fun at Jews. This confuses people, and it causes some problems. How do we reconcile his obvious genius with his flawed human nature? And so the way people deal with this is to brush the issue of his anti-Semitism under the carpet. Pretend it's not there. Focus all your attention instead on the wonderful, inspiring works of literature that he wrote. Enjoy the good bits and edit out the bad bits, because we're better off without them, right? So this morning, we are considering Psalm 139 together. Truly, this is a wonderful, majestic piece of literature. Now, of course, it's more than that. It has marvellous things to teach us about God. One writer describes this poem as one of the summits of Old Testament poetry. It teaches us about how awesome God is, how wide and deep his knowledge of us is. Do you want a passage on God's omniscience, on how he knows everything? This is the passage you go to. And here also David the author speaks about the wonders of how God creates us in the womb with spine-tingling poetry. Many of us will be very familiar with these sections of the poem, especially in the Christian response to the evil of abortion, where verse 14 and 15, for instance, says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Surely that's a poster verse right there. That's an Instagram quote worthy of liking. So imagine our surprise then as we read this psalm when we get to verse 19. Suddenly, the poem seems to switch from the noble to the venomous. These latter few verses seem out of place in such an uplifting, inspirational writing. And so, how do we deal with these verses? Well, mostly, I think, the same way that we deal with T.S. Eliot's anti-Semitism, by ignoring the messy bits at the end of the psalm. We pretend it's not there. I venture to suggest that some of you might well have been familiar with most of this psalm before we read it this morning, yet now are surprised to discover these last 6 verses, or at least verses 19 to 22, because they don't get put on posters, they don't get put on Instagram quotes, even if you've read them before, because they seem so out of kilter, so disjointed from the encouragement of the rest, that perhaps you've edited them out of your memory. We focus on the uplifting opening, and we censor the awkward bit at the end. This morning, we're going to do the opposite. Not only are the last 6 verses an essential part of the psalm, Alec Matier suggests that, in fact, the whole of the preceding psalm is preparatory to the prayer at the end. Verses 1 to 18 are the introduction, the starter. Verses 19 to 24 are the main course, the essential theme of the psalm. So, this morning then, let's take an overview of Psalm 139 verses 1 to 18. And then finally, we'll look at verses 19 to 24, hopefully in a new light. The psalm neatly breaks down for us into 4 blocks of 6 verses. And each of these 6 verse blocks, we have 4 verses that explore God's characteristics, and then 2 more verses that focus more on David's personal reflection and response to the truths that he's meditating on. So let's start with the first section, number 1, how God knows me. How God knows me. We live in an information age. Our tech tracks everything we do. Google keeps all your search histories. Your phone provider knows where you've physically been. The websites you visit add cookies to your computer or your phone to track every click of the mouse or every swipe of your finger. The CCTV cameras that are everywhere record your facial features, and the ANPR cameras track your car as you drive around the motorways. And yet, this is nothing compared to David's understanding of the God who sees and knows everything about our lives. Verses 1 to 4 document for us the knowledge of God that makes our implementation of big data look like a scribbled shopping list in comparison. Look at the word pairs that emphasize to us how comprehensive God's knowledge of us is. Searched and known, sit down and rise up, my path, my lying down. The conclusion, verse 3, is comprehensive. You are acquainted with all my ways. And note that this isn't just knowledge of the things that you have done in the past. Verse 4 tells us that God has foreknowledge of us as well. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. As powerful, as rich, and as clever as Jeff Bezos is, his Alexa knows what you say to her only after she has decoded it. God knows what you will say before your brain even encodes it. Verse 5 suggests that being known so intimately, so completely, makes the psalmist slightly uncomfortable. It means God knows us as we truly are. There's no pretending with God. There's no hiding behind the mask of respectability we wear to appear as decent to other humans. God reads the browsing history of our hearts, and it makes for uncomfortable reading. It exposes our sin. God knows us more deeply, more intimately than we even know ourselves. His knowledge of us is quite literally beyond us. God's knowledge is beyond my range, beyond my reach, and beyond my power. No one likes to be under intense scrutiny. How does your life, your heart, match up to God's searching? Does that make you feel uncomfortable? It should do. The second block of 6 verses, verses 7 to 12, is how God surrounds me. David now shifts to considering God's presence. Uncomfortable with a level of scrutiny from an all-knowing God. Is it possible to flee his presence? No, David tells us. We have 3 ultimate contrasts here to emphasize the comprehensiveness, the completeness, the totality of the presence of God. The comparison of verse 9 is between the east, where the sun rises in the morning, and the west, which is the Mediterranean Sea, from David's perspective in the land of Israel. So east to west. There is no height, no depth, no geographical extreme that is beyond God's presence. No matter where David imagines fleeing to, God is not distant, but already there, close at hand. Literally, the hand that leads him. Verse 10. The arms that bear David up, the right hand of God that holds him, encompasses the whole universe. And this is possible because the reality is that God is actually, in essence, utterly different from us. We are embodied spiritual creatures. We can only be in one place at once. But God is not. God is a spirit, verse 7. And therefore there is nowhere that God is not present. The totality of this is evident to David in verses 11 and 12, where he says to himself, look, even darkness and light don't make any difference to God. Men love the darkness to hide in, the shadows of night to flee from scrutiny. Darkness is as light to God. There is no hiding anything from him. Does this knowledge of God's presence everywhere change how you behave? Because it should do. Maybe you saw the recent episode of the TV series The Crown, where Lady Diana Spencer first meets the Queen. If not, you can probably even still imagine it. When meeting the Queen, people do behave very differently, don't they? They dress appropriately. They have to learn when to speak and when not to speak, and what to say and what not to say. They have to learn the proper way of curtsying or bowing to show the proper respect to the Queen. Being in the Queen's presence changes how people behave. So it should be with God also, when you realize he is ever present with you. Do you realize God is ever present, aware of you, watching your actions? How God knows me, how God surrounds me. Thirdly, how God has made me, verses 13 to 18. Not only is God all-knowing and all-present, he is also all-creating. Scientists continue to explore how life started, the point at which inorganic material became a living being. Well, verse 13 has some wisdom for them if they're interested in the answer of how life originated. What our translations here have as inmost being or inward parts is literally the word for kidneys in the original language. And the Hebrew people figuratively considered the kidneys as the seat of the emotions in the body. So the sense here isn't just that God has woven together your sinews, bones and flesh, perhaps as a weaver constructs a basket, but also in addition to the physical, so too the emotional life. The character of the person here is being constructed. Do you realise that your character and your personality are defined for you by God? But still, David goes even further than that. Verse 16 speaks of God decreeing all our days in advance as he predestines our life's purpose and direction, shaping for us the journey of our lives, the path of our lives, constructing every small detail of the narrative of our experience. The eminent evangelist for atheism, Richard Dawkins, wants us to believe differently. He wants us to believe that DNA neither knows nor cares. It just is. And we dance to its music. His view, that we have no ultimate purpose or worth, is the complete opposite of what David is sharing here. David sees life authored from God, and he worships, verse 14, for the sheer wonder of life, the gift of life. Life that is greater than simply biology, more than just a physical miracle. We are more than just animated cells. We are personalities. We are people. We are created for relationship, created for purpose and for a destiny. Created to be in relationship with each other and with our Creator, verse 17. Conceived to worship through many days of loving care, and then to be preserved for an everlasting resurrection relationship of joy in God's presence in the new creation. That's the reference there in the end of verse 18. To still being alive, to still being there at the end. Are you using your life to praise and worship your Creator? Do you wonder at the miracle and meaning of life and worship the one who gave you that life, who wants to preserve it for you beyond death? The God that is all-knowing, all-present, and all-creating. That is theology, teaching and understanding that speaks powerfully about God's world. Imagine a world created by such a wise, present, caring, powerful Creator. One who fashions perfect humans to live in harmony and worship, living purposeful lives of wonder, discovery, beauty and praise. What a world! Sounds like a pipe dream though, doesn't it? That's not the world we're living in at all. The world we live in has children with bone cancer. It has Boxing Day tsunamis that kill nearly 250,000 people. It has global pandemics that kill 2 million people and counting, and leave countless tens of millions more in poverty. It's increasingly a world where leaders of governments lie to their people and act for their own selfish gains rather than the good of the people they govern. Death, disease, corruption, and evil. We live in a world that has been broken and cursed because of our sin and because of our rebellion. Evil abounds. And it makes us angry, doesn't it? What is an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-present, all-creating God doing, allowing evil to ravage his creation? David tells us what he's doing. He's testing us. How God tests me, verses 19 to 24. This is the highlight, the main course, the bit that David comes to in climax. Because the wonderful world sketched in verses 1 to 18 is blighted by wicked people who are opposed to God. David knows this. He's a realist about the mess that he sees. David has surveyed the world, but then he's conditioned his heart with 18 verses of theology. Then, and only then, is he ready to pray the prayer of verses 19 to 24. We, friends, we can learn from David's reaction to this evil. What is our natural reaction to evil? A sense of justice burns within us. And then we want to do something, anything, to rescind, to respond. Whether it's an ill-considered tweet we bang out, or a harsh word spoken against others, or a political demonstration that we want to go on, or perhaps worse, violence met with violence. We want to add our personal action to help resolve the issues. The many demonstrations in the US and the UK this past year have shown us exactly this reaction. But not David. David's not out in the streets of Jerusalem organising a march against evil. We need to be more like David. Instead of turning to anger or spiteful reactions or harmful actions, we need to learn to handle wickedness with prayer. Oh, but how does David pray? Does the extreme nature of David's prayer shock you? Verse 19, David prays for the death of the wicked, for banishment of violence. He speaks of hating those who hate God, verse 21 and 22. My goodness, David, that's a bit of an extreme reaction, isn't it? Aren't we called for compassion? Aren't we called to turn the other cheek as Christians? And here is the truth. Here is the shocking reality. What we see in David's prayer is not spite, but zeal for God. Zeal for God's ways, for God's standards, for God's justice. Perhaps we find these words shocking because we love sin too much. Perhaps we find these words shocking because we love our sin too much. We don't care enough about the effects of sin on the world that God made previously good. David is facing a choice. He has a choice whether to join with the evil ways of the world or to side with God and take God's solution to the evil. And here, at Christmas time, in 2020, in the Spen Valley, we face exactly the same choice. We are faced with evil every single day, all around us. A society, a culture in open rebellion against God's standards. But we are made in God's image as moral beings. And each of us, we have a choice. Will we side with the right or with the wrong? Will we side with God or with God's enemies? There is a choice for each of us to make. Life is one big, long test. How will you choose? Will you follow evil, or will you follow the one sent by God, Jesus Christ, who came to make evil a thing of the past? It starts by us realizing that we are part of the problem, that we too have sinned and rebelled against God. we too are counted as evil in God's sight. But look, the good news of Christmas is that God himself became a man. The God-man Jesus. His very name means Saviour, because he would save his people from their sins. He does so by dealing with our evil, carrying the penalty for it in himself on the cross. And in doing so, he has earned the ultimate right to rule and judge all who ever lived. Jesus will one day restore and renew the wonders of creation to the way that they were meant to be, and he will dole out righteous judgment to all those who continue to oppose him. Ultimate judgment is a truth that should give us absolute comfort. Knowing that King Jesus will judge all evil, it should be a liberating truth for us. It means that we can rest secure in the knowledge that all wrongs will ultimately be righted. Our place in this life isn't to campaign for justice for every evil, but to take it to Jesus and to trust him to deal with it. Hence why Paul can write to the Christians at Rome, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. I will repay.'" So can we learn lessons from David's prayer here? In conclusion then, here are three things that I think we need to do. Verses 19 and 20, we need to identify with Jesus. The first step is to see wickedness for what it is and separate ourselves from the wicked, for they are heading for destruction. Not separating ourselves physically, but culturally. The name of Jesus becomes important to us. Our identity needs to be in Jesus, not in the ways of the wicked. Can you nail your flag to the mast of Jesus in 2021? Secondly, verses 21 and 22, we need to side with Jesus. When we say side with Jesus, we say care about what he wants. Develop your priorities of your life to advance his kingdom. Align your thinking, your morals, your standards with God's standards, not the destructive behaviours of the world which brings on them judgment. We seek to learn more of what Jesus taught, that we might be more righteous and less hypocritical with our views. Can you change your attitudes and thinking to be more Jesus-oriented in 2021? And thirdly, in verses 23 and 24, we need to please Jesus. Even after we identify with Jesus and side with Jesus, there will still be much in our lives that offend him, that displeases him. We will quickly and easily fall back into bad habits, into sinful ways. And these verses encourage us to invite Jesus to look into our hearts with divine scrutiny. Ask him to take control of your ways to eradicate sin and direct your thoughts and actions to him. When we ask Jesus to search our hearts, he will root out our sin and he will lead us in the way everlasting. Can you commit to doing that in the coming year? We need to learn to live the theology of verses 1 to 18 so that our hearts better match the morality of verses 19 to 24. Remember God's knowledge, rejoice in God's presence, marvel in God's creative power, and choose to follow Jesus over evil every single day. We need this distinctiveness of obedience. We need lives shaped by biblical commands, standards, precepts, and examples. We need to be like Jesus. Then we will be better equipped to see God's kingdom come in Cleckheaton in 2021.